Imagine a country where the inflation rate suddenly hits 3,000%.
Right, just completely off the charts.
Exactly. Like the national currency basically collapses, the economy stagnates for a solid decade, and all the international headlines just paint this picture of total financial devastation.
Yeah, you'd picture a totally failed state, right?
Right. You would imagine crumbling buildings, a totally collapsed health system, and a population that's just completely disconnected from the modern world.
Because that's what usually happens.
Exactly. But what if I told you that this exact same country, during that exact same period of extreme monetary chaos, simultaneously wiped out its out-of-school populations
Huh.
and brought child mortality down by nearly 90%, and somehow, against all odds, managed to keep virtually 100% of its population wired into the modern electrical grid?
I mean, it sounds impossible. It honestly sounds like two completely different countries just, existing in the same physical space.
It really does. It completely breaks the mental models we usually use to understand how nations work. So, welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are unpacking this fascinating, almost unbelievable national contradiction.
It is a wild ride for sure.
It is. And we've built this session specifically for you, the learner. So whether you're prepping for a high-level meeting on Latin American emerging markets or trying to understand global economic resilience, or, maybe you're just someone who loves a truly baffling data mystery that challenges everything you thought you knew, this is for you. We're going to look past all those sensational headlines and really dig into the raw numbers.
And the numbers we are looking at are incredibly robust. We're using a highly specific, customized 15-part framework today. It's based on over 60 years of World Bank Development Indicator data, what economists usually call the WDI database.
Right, the gold standard, basically.
Exactly. We're tracking Argentina from 1960 all the way through 2024. So this is a deeply empirical, data-driven roadmap. We're mapping out macroeconomic trends, social welfare metrics, and environmental resource usage.
So what does this all mean? What is the actual mission of today's deep dive? We're trying to solve a core paradox here. How does a country achieve world-class structural progress in human capital, things like education, health, digitalization, while simultaneously enduring some of the most violent, volatile macroeconomic earthquakes in modern history?
It really is a paradox.
It's like watching a patient who is somehow, I don't know, running a sub-3-hour marathon while simultaneously experiencing a massive cardiac arrest.
That's a great way to visualize it, actually, because usually when we look at national development, we expect the data to tell a single cohesive story.
Right, everything goes up together or down together.
Exactly. The arrows all point up or they all point down.
Yeah.
If the macroeconomy is failing, we just assume the social fabric must be fraying right alongside it. But the WDI data for Argentina shows us something entirely different. It shows us that vulnerability and resilience can, and actively do, coexist.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because before we even touch the wild economic swings, the hyperinflation, or the currency defaults, we have to start at the absolute foundation. We have to understand who this data is tracking and where they physically live.
Right, the demographics.
Yeah. If you want to understand how a house survives a hurricane, you don't start by measuring the wind speed, You start by looking at the foundation. So let's talk about that demographic bedrock.
Let's do it. And the demographic shift in Argentina over the last half-century is profound. If we rewind back to the 1960s, Argentina's population growth rate was sitting at around 1.6% annually.
Which is pretty solid, right?
Yeah, that's a fairly robust growth phase. But as we track the data along the curve toward the present day, that growth rate has steadily and permanently declined to under 1%.
Now, just to make sure we're all on the same page here, a declining population growth rate is pretty standard for a country as it develops, right? I mean, people have fewer children as they move to cities and gain access to better healthcare and education.
It is standard, yes, but we really can't look at that number in isolation. What's critical here is the accompanying shift in the age dependency ratio, specifically the old age dependency ratio.
Let me stop you there for a second, because that term can sound like a lot of economic jargon.
Fair enough.
So the old age dependency ratio, we are basically talking about the mathematical ratio of older dependents, meaning people older than 64, compared to the working age population, which is roughly ages 15 to 64. It's a measure of how many retirees each active worker is economically supporting.
Precisely. And in the 1960s, that ratio in Argentina was 8.3%. But today, It has more than doubled to 18.8%.
Wait, double?
Yes, more than double.
That's a massive structural shift. I mean, that means the working age population is carrying a progressively heavier load every single year. It changes everything about pension obligations, healthcare costs, just the general economic dynamism of a society.
It does. It places an enormous underlying pressure on the state to generate revenue just to maintain the status quo.
Yeah.
But that aging curve is really only half of the physical reality of the Argentine population.
Right.
While they are aging and growing more slowly, they have also fundamentally relocated. They've physically moved.
Oh, let's get into that because the urbanization data here is staggering. In 1960, Argentina's urbanization rate was already relatively high for the region, sitting at about 72%. But today, the data shows it has climbed past 92%.
Yeah, it's incredibly high.
Let that sink in for a second. 92% of the population lives in urban centers.
Which makes Argentina a quintessential textbook example of Latin American hyperurbanization. When we talk about the Argentine economy, we are not talking about a scattered agrarian society spread out over vast distances. We are talking about highly concentrated, dense metropolitan hubs.
Right. Millions of people packed into Buenos Aires, Cordoba, Rosario.
Exactly.
And this brings up a huge question for me. If I'm looking at this from a logistical standpoint, having 92% of your population packed into cities, especially while your national economy is famously struggling to stay afloat, how does the physical infrastructure not just collapse under the weight of that demand?
That is the exact right question to ask. And this is where the World Bank data reveals what we might call a quiet infrastructure victory.
A quiet victory. I like that.
Yeah, it's the kind of victory that doesn't make international news, but it completely defines the daily reality of millions of people. Despite the macroeconomic chaos we'll discuss later, the national electricity coverage in Argentina has reached a definitive 100%.
Okay, I have to push back on this or at least ask for extreme clarification. 100%. Literally everyone.
Literally 100%.
In a country that has gone through multiple sovereign debt defaults and extreme currency devaluations, they somehow managed to wire every single home to the grid.
According to the empirical data, yes. The coverage has essentially completed its arc. And it's not just the dense urban centers where stringing power lines is, relatively cheap and easy.
Right, city grids are one thing.
Exactly. The data shows that rural access to electricity experienced a similar completion trajectory. Even the remaining 8% of the population that is not in major urban centers has been systematically brought onto the modern grid.
That is wild, and it goes beyond just flipping a light switch, right? I saw the data point on clean cooking fuels, which I think is one of the most underrated metrics of human development out there.
Oh, absolutely. It's crucial. The access to clean fuels and technologies for cooking hit 99.9%.
Let's explain why that matters, because clean cooking fuel kind of sounds like an environmental talking point, but it's actually a massive public health and economic indicator.
It really is.
When people don't have clean cooking fuels, meaning they are burning wood or charcoal or animal waste inside their homes, the rates of respiratory disease skyrocket, especially among women and children. It also means someone, usually a child, is spending hours a day foraging for fuel instead of going to school.
You're exactly right. If we connect this to the bigger picture, transitioning a population from solid biomass fuels to natural gas or electricity for cooking is a monumental leap in human welfare. And what's fascinating here is the rural transformation within those numbers.
Right, because rural areas are usually the last to get those upgrades.
Exactly. It is incredibly difficult and expensive to deliver clean cooking infrastructure to remote areas. But the data shows that access in rural areas skyrocketed from 77.6% to 98.2% over the measured period.
So, practically speaking, the entire country is plugged in. They have power, and they aren't breathing in toxic smoke when they make dinner. Let me float an analogy here to see if I'm grasping the mechanics of this.
Oh, for it.
I'm picturing Argentina like a brilliantly constructed house in a severe hurricane zone.
Okay, I can see that.
The macroeconomy, the inflation, the interest rates, the currency crises, that's the hurricane. It's loud, it's destructive, it's ripping the shingles off the roof. But the foundation of the house, the power grid, the physical city infrastructure, the demographic structure is actually incredibly solid. It's built of reinforced concrete.
That is a highly accurate way to conceptualize it. The hurricane is raging, but the foundation holds. And if we ask why this structural bedrock matters so much during a financial crisis, It comes down to adaptation and crisis response.
Right, because how you respond to a crisis depends entirely on the tools you have available.
Exactly. When an economic hurricane hits, a disconnected, rural, unelectrified population is incredibly vulnerable. They lack access to emergency information. They lack modern logistics. If their local crop fails or the local currency dries up, they have no alternative means of generating income.
They're just trapped.
Yes, but a highly urbanized, fully electrified population has options. They can pivot. They can communicate. They can transition into the informal gig economy. They can access digital safety nets. They can organize. The physical bedrock allows the society to bend under extreme pressure without snapping.
That makes perfect sense. The infrastructure acts as a physical shock absorber. But that naturally leads us to ask,
It's a huge achievement.
and it holds up as they get older, too. The proportion of adolescents out of lower secondary school has plummeted to under 1%. We're talking about fractions of a percent here, like 0.12% for primary school-age children in recent years. It's near total absorption of the youth into the educational system.
And we have to ask how a country achieves that, because that level of educational absorption doesn't just happen by accident, and it certainly doesn't happen for free. It requires immense, sustained financial commitment from the state.
Especially when the state's coffers are constantly under threat from economic shocks.
Exactly. But the data reflects a deliberate policy choice. The adjusted savings on education expenditure grew from roughly 1.4% of gross national income, or GNI, to over 5%.
Let's clarify GNI really quickly for the learner. We hear GDP a lot, gross domestic product, which is the total value of everything produced inside a country's borders. GNI, gross national income, is slightly different.
Right, it includes a bit more.
Yeah, it's the total income earned by a country's people and businesses, regardless of whether that income was generated inside the country or abroad. So when we say education expenditure went from 1.4% to over 5% of GNI, we are saying that a massively larger slice of the total national wealth was deliberately carved out and handed over to the education system.
Yes, and maintaining, let alone tripling, that share of expenditure while the national currency is experiencing extreme turbulence. I mean, that shows a profound societal consensus.
Like a baseline agreement that education is untouchable.
Exactly. It shows an underlying agreement across political lines that human capital is the ultimate long-term asset. You might not be able to trust the currency in your pocket, but you can trust the value of a literate, educated workforce.
Okay, so we have an educated, electrified populace, but I have to bring up the elephant in the room. What happens to the social fabric when the economy breaks? Because the data shows that the Argentine economy didn't just bend, at times it violently broke. How do you measure the social damage of a financial collapse?
The most revealing metric for that is the inequality data. Specifically, we need to look at the Gini coefficient.
Right. For those who might be a bit rusty, the Gini coefficient is the standard economic measure of wealth or income distribution within a nation. It's a scale from 0 to 100.
Correct.
0 represents perfect equality, meaning everyone in the country has the exact same amount of money. 100 represents absolute inequality, meaning one single person has all the wealth and everyone else has absolutely nothing. Obviously, real countries fall somewhere in the middle, but the lower the number, the more equal the society.
And if we look at Argentina's Gini coefficient during the massive financial meltdown of 2001 and 2002, we see a terrifying spike.
I want to pause here and really vividly describe what 2001 and 2002 looked like, just based on the historical context of this data, because this wasn't just a mild recession.
Not at all. It was catastrophic.
This was a crisis that essentially wiped out the banking system. It led to the largest sovereign debt default in history up to that point. The government literally froze people's bank accounts, a policy known locally as the corralito, so citizens couldn't even withdraw their own savings while the currency's value just evaporated.
It was a systemic trauma. And the Gini coefficient reflects that trauma perfectly. During that crisis, the index spiked to a massive 53.8.
53.8 is extraordinarily high. That is the mathematical visualization of a society tearing itself apart. It represents the middle class falling into absolute poverty virtually overnight, while the very top tier perhaps manages to shield their wealth in foreign assets.
But here is where the story of resilience emerges. The data doesn't stay at 53.8. If it were a truly failed state, the inequality would have locked in at that extreme level permanently.
Right, it would just become the new normal.
Exactly. Instead, through aggressive structural social policies over the subsequent decade, the Gini coefficient was actively repaired. It was brought down and stabilized around the 41 to 42 mark.
Let me stop you because I want to understand the actual mechanisms of that repair. How does a government practically shrink the wealth gap after a financial meltdown of that magnitude? You can't just magically print wealth and hand it to the poor without causing more inflation.
Well, you do it through targeted social safety nets and wealth transfers. While we are strictly following the World Bank data points, the economic reality behind this drop in the Gini coefficient involves massive expansions of social programs.
What kind of programs?
Governments implement structural policies like universal child allowances, so direct cash transfers to vulnerable families, provided that their children attend school and receive vaccinations. They subsidize basic utilities. They expand pension coverage to workers who spent their lives in the informal economy and previously had no retirement safety net.
So they basically created a floor. They said the macroeconomic ceiling might be collapsing, but we are going to build a concrete floor of basic social welfare so people don't fall into the abyss.
Exactly. And the most striking proof that this concrete floor worked is found in the public health data. Specifically, the efficacy of the health system in keeping its most vulnerable citizens alive. The WDI data on under-5 mortality in Argentina shows a literal cliff drop over the measured period.
Yeah, I'm looking at the chart and it's a beautifully steep downward curve. We're looking at historical highs in the mid to late 20th century of nearly 40,000 child deaths a year. 40,000. And that number has been steadily, relentlessly driven down to roughly 5,000 cases a year recently.
To put that into perspective, that is not just a statistical improvement. That is a complete transformation of public health outcomes. To achieve an 80 to 90% reduction in child mortality, you cannot just build a few shiny hospitals in the capital city.
Right, because child mortality is a multivariable problem. To fix it, you need clean water, which ties back to the infrastructure we discussed. You need rural clinics. You need a robust cold chain logistics network to deliver vaccines to every corner of the country.
You need educated mothers, too.
Exactly. Mothers who understand prenatal care, which directly ties back to that 99.4% school enrollment.
If we connect all of this to the bigger picture, it is astonishing. It is highly unusual for a developing economy to suffer a catastrophic financial meltdown, experience a massive spike in inequality, and then actively shrink its wealth gap and drastically reduce child mortality in the immediate aftermath.
It's almost unheard of.
Usually a sovereign default of that magnitude permanently fractures the social safety net. The institutions hollow out. In Argentina, the data proves that the safety net was not only deployed, it was expanded, and it empirically worked. So think about how rare it is for a developing economy to actively shrink its wealth gap after a massive financial meltdown. What stands out to you about that resilience?
It's such a crucial pivot point in our deep dive. Let's synthesize what we've established so far. The learner is listening to this and thinking, okay, the population is highly urbanized. They are 100% electrified. They have clean cooking fuels. Their kids are surviving past childhood at rates rivaling developed nations. They are universally enrolled in primary school. The state pours massive amounts of its income into education. The wealth gap, while still present, was actively repaired after a massive crisis. We have a highly developed, resilient human capital profile.
A profoundly robust social foundation.
Right. So why? Why is the dominant global narrative about Argentina one of relentless, exhausting economic crisis? If the people are doing all the right things, why does the macroeconomy look like a disaster zone?
Because, to return to your earlier analogy, the hurricane is just as real as the foundation. The foundation held, but the storm has been raging for decades. And that brings us to the next dimension of our analysis, the macroeconomic earthquake and the middle income trap.
Okay, here we go.
Here is where we look at the numbers that define the turbulence. We have to look at the violent whiplash of national income.
Whiplash is honestly the only word that does it justice. When you track the World Bank data for adjusted net national income growth, which is basically how much real wealth the country is adding or losing each year, after accounting for depreciation and resource depletion, the single-year swings are mind-boggling.
They are extreme. You are reading the data sequentially, and you see a sudden drop of 30% in national income.
Next 30%. A drop of 3 or 4% in the U.S. or Europe is considered a severe panic-inducing recession.
Exactly, and it's followed by another drop of 38%. But then, almost immediately, the data shows a surge of 63% growth, then up another 38%.
It's not a normal business cycle. It's a heart monitor during a cardiac event. The line is just violently spiking up and down. How does a business or a normal family even plan for next year when the entire national income might shrink by a third or grow by 2/3?
The short answer is, they can't. Long-term planning is replaced by short-term survival tactics. And this volatility is perfectly mirrored in the journey of Argentina's GDP per capita, measured in constant 2015 US dollars.
Let's track that journey because it's a total roller coaster. During that 2001-2002 crash, the GDP per capita hit rock bottom. It fell to roughly $11,150. Absolute economic devastation for the average citizen.
But then it roars back. Driven by a global commodities boom and the recovery of idle industrial capacity, the economy surges. By 2011, it hits an all-time peak of over $14,040 per capita. It's an incredible recovery narrative.
But then it hits a brick wall. The high-speed train just stops.
Yes, from 2011 onward through 2021 and beyond, the data shows a long, grueling plateau, a decade of stagnation and slight recession. This, for the learner listening, is the textbook empirical definition of the middle income trap.
I want to spend a minute explaining the mechanics of the middle income trap because it's one of the most important concepts in global economics. When a country is poor, it can grow very quickly by moving peasants from low productivity farming into basic manufacturing.
Right, exactly.
Labor is cheap, so exports are competitive. That's the easy growth phase.
You're essentially just utilizing resources that were previously sitting idle.
But eventually, as the country gets richer, wages go up. The workers demand better pay, better conditions, a middle-class lifestyle. Suddenly, your labor isn't cheap anymore. You can't compete with the poorer countries on price. So to keep growing, you have to compete on innovation.
Yes?
You have to start designing the microchips instead of just assembling them. You need high-tech industries, advanced services, highly efficient capital markets.
And that transition from growth based on accumulation of cheap labor and capital to growth based on innovation and productivity is incredibly difficult.
No.
Very few countries successfully make that leap. The middle income trap is what happens when a country loses its competitive edge in cheap manufacturing, but hasn't yet built the institutional and technological capacity to compete with the advanced economies of Europe, North America, or East Asia.
They get stuck in the middle.
And Argentina has been stuck there for over a decade. They recovered the lost ground from the 2001 crash they exported, and a major reason they couldn't make that leap brings us to the most traumatic data point in our entire set. We cannot talk about Argentina's macroeconomy without talking about the history of hyperinflation.
This is the data point that breaks my brain. Let's zero in on the years 1989 to 1990. The WDI data tracks the GDP deflator, which is the broadest possible measure of inflation across the entire economy. During that period, the GDP deflator spiked to over 3,000%.
Let's pause and really consider the physical reality of a 3,000% inflation rate.
I was trying to come up with an analogy, Fess, earlier. I used to think of it like a compass changing north every 5 years, but that doesn't really capture the pain. It's more like trying to build a house or measure the length of a room using a ruler that physically shrinks by half every time you look away from it.
That is exactly what it feels like. It fundamentally alters the psychology of a nation. Money is supposed to be a store of value and a medium of exchange. When it loses its value that rapidly, the fundamental trust in the state's accounting system vanishes. You get paid on a Friday, and by Monday, your salary can buy 20% less food.
So what do people do? Because people still have to eat.
They adapt, usually in ways that hurt the long-term economy. You don't save in the local currency. Saving is mathematically irrational when the money is evaporating. You consume immediately. You buy physical goods, cars, real estate, washing machines, just to hold on to value. Or you hoard foreign reserves, like US dollars, effectively removing capital from your own banking system.
Which means the local banks don't have deposits to lend out to businesses, which stifles innovation, which just reinforces the middle income trap. It's a vicious cycle.
Precisely. Now, regarding the inflation data specifically, there is a fascinating, highly unusual footnote in the World Bank database that we need to address, particularly regarding the period from 2007 to 2015.
Oh, right, the alternative CPI models, the shadow index.
Exactly. And we bring this up not to endorse any specific political viewpoint, left or right, but to impartially report what the data sources in the academic community documented. During the specific 2007 to 2015 window, independent economic researchers, notably Cavallo and Bertolato, along with various international bodies, noticed a glaring discrepancy.
The official numbers just didn't match the reality on the street.
They diverged sharply. The official inflation figures reported by the state were significantly lower than the market realities observed by consumers and independent analysts. The discrepancy became so large that researchers had to essentially construct alternative consumer price index, or CPI, models.
I read about how they did this, and from a data science perspective, it is absolutely fascinating. Because the official measurement tool was essentially broken or disputed, these researchers had to scrape online prices, literally downloading the daily prices of milk, bread, and electronics from online supermarkets to build a massive, real-time shadow index just to figure out what things actually cost.
From a macroeconomic perspective, it perfectly illustrates the challenge of analyzing an economy under stress. When the primary measurement tool's in dispute, the market relies on extreme innovation just to establish baseline facts.
It's incredible. But here's where it gets really interesting for me. Let's take a step back and look at the whole board. We have a middle income trap. We have a history of 3,000% inflation. We have periods where the actual pricing data is so disputed that scientists have to scrape grocery websites to find the truth. We have national income plunging 38% in a year.
It is an environment of profound, exhausting uncertainty.
And yet, the lights stay on, 100% electrification, the kids go to school, 99.4% primary enrollment, the health clinics administer vaccines and slash child mortality.
Which forces the ultimate question of this entire deep dive. If the currency is constantly failing and the macroeconomy is trapped in stagnation, how does the average citizen in the country itself actually survive? What is physically paying for that resilient social foundation?
And that takes us directly to the next dimension of our analysis, the twin shock absorbers. Because the WDI data points to two massive underlying economic engines that act as stabilizers. They keep the ship afloat while the storm rages. I like to call them soil and silicon.
Soil and silicon, I like that.
Let's start with the soil, the agricultural miracle.
When you look at the agricultural sector data, you see an industry that didn't just survive the macroeconomic chaos, it became a hyper-productive, globally competitive engine.
The numbers are undeniable. We are looking at cereal yields, which measures the productivity, the sheer volume of crop yield per hectare of land. In the 1960s, Argentina was producing roughly 1,400 kilograms of cereal per hectare. Fast forward to recent years, and that number has skyrocketed to over 5,400 kilograms per hectare.
That is a near four-fold increase in efficiency, a 300% jump in sheer productivity from the exact same amount of earth.
So while the financial markets in Buenos Aires were in absolute disarray, the farmers out in the provinces were just quietly innovating.
Yes, and the mechanism behind this yield explosion is crucial. It wasn't just good weather. It was driven by a massive, aggressive adoption of modern agricultural technology. The data shows this clearly in the fertilizer metrics. Fertilizer consumption spiked from under 1 kilogram per hectare of arable land to over 38 kilograms per hectare.
They industrialized their soil.
They embraced the Green Revolution at a highly sophisticated, localized level. And we have to explain why this matters so much to the whole country, not just the farmers. This agricultural explosion generated immense, reliable, globally demanded export value. Soybeans, corn, wheat. The world always needs to eat, regardless of what the Argentine peso is doing.
I see the mechanism. The land essentially insulated the country from total collapse by acting as a printing press for hard currency. When your own currency is failing and nobody wants to buy your state bonds, you can still put 1 million tons of soybeans on a ship to Asia and get paid in US dollars.
Precisely. The agricultural sector provided the vital foreign exchange reserves the central bank desperately needed to function, to import essential medicines, and to keep the gears of the state turning. The soil is the traditional historical shock absorber.
But then we have the silicon. And for me, the digital and financial inclusion data is the hidden hero of this entire deep dive. It's the modern shock absorber. Let's look at the S-curve of digitalization.
The S-curve is the classic shape of technological adoption. It starts flat, curves up sharply as the technology explodes, and then flattens out again at the top as the market saturates.
And Argentina's S-curve for internet usage is just beautiful. In the year 2000, internet usage was hovering near 0%, just a tiny fraction of early adopters. Fast forward roughly 2 decades, and it has exploded to nearly 90% of the population. We also see fixed broadband subscriptions going from the hundreds of thousands up into the tens of millions.
That digital takeoff is impressive, but it's standard for many developing middle-income countries. The real aha moment in the data, the metric that actually explains how the vulnerable survive the economic hurricane, is financial inclusion.
Let's dig into this because the numbers seem to literally defy gravity. The World Bank data shows that overall account ownership at a financial institution or mobile money provider jumped from 33% to over 71%.
And if we look even closer, the data on the poorest segment of the population is stunning. Account ownership among the poorest 40% of the population skyrocketed from 19.6% to over 74.6%.
Okay, stop right there. I have to push back on this, or at least play devil's advocate, because logically this does not track with the macroeconomic narrative we just built.
How's
We just spent 20 minutes talking about a decade of economic stagnation, the middle income trap, severe inflation, and a public that fundamentally distrusts the national currency. How on earth do you get millions of citizens, specifically the poorest, most vulnerable citizens, banked during a stagnant economic decade? Traditional brick-and-mortar banks do not usually rush to open expensive new branches in poor, informal neighborhoods during a severe recession. So how does that physical expansion happen?
It doesn't happen through traditional banks. That massive jump from 19.6% to 74.6% for the poorest cohort was achieved through the digital leapfrog.
The digital leapfrog. Explain the mechanics of that.
Leapfrogging happens when a developing society skips an older, slower, or more expensive technology and jumps straight to the modern solution. They didn't build brick-and-mortar bank branches with tellers and vaults. They bypassed that entirely through mobile money and digital payment platforms, fintech.
Like digital wallets on smartphones.
Exactly. When the traditional banking infrastructure is vulnerable, distrusted, or simply inaccessible to lower-income urban populations, technology provides a direct bypass. Fintech platforms became a vital lifeline. Remember those social policies we discussed earlier? The child allowances and welfare transfers designed to repair the Gini coefficient.
Yes, the concrete floor.
Right. How do you deliver that cash to a mother in a poor, informal neighborhood who doesn't have a traditional bank account? You deliver it digitally. These mobile platforms allowed the poorest 40% to receive government social transfers directly and instantly.
Which also means they can participate in the formal economy.
Yes, and crucially, the informal gig economy. If you are a delivery driver or a street vendor, a digital wallet allows you to transact seamlessly. Furthermore, in an environment of high inflation, carrying physical cash is dangerous, not just physically, but mathematically. Its value is melting in your pocket.
Right. Time is money, literally.
Exactly. Digital platforms allow for faster velocity of money. You can receive payment and instantly spend it on groceries, or pay a utility bill before the currency devalues further.
So the smartphone essentially became the bank vault, the marketplace, and the shield against the macroeconomy all at once.
It did. The combination of these two elements, ultra-productive agriculture generating national export wealth, and digital mobile platforms providing localized financial lifelines to the urban poor, created a highly effective dual shock absorption system, the soil and the silicon.
It's a brilliant survival mechanism, but survival always has a cost. The agricultural boom, the massive fertilizer production, the server farms keeping tens of millions of mobile wallets active, the 100% electrification of the grid, none of that happens by magic. It requires immense amounts of physical energy. And that brings us to the final dimension of our analysis, the carbon cost and the Global Trade Balancing Act.
Right. Every system has a trade-off. And here we see the environmental trade-offs required to fuel this survival mechanism. The WDI data reveals a very stubborn dependency. Despite global trends toward renewable energy, Argentina's energy consumption remains overwhelmingly tied to fossil fuels.
I'm looking at the percentage, and it is incredibly rigid. The percentage of fossil fuel energy consumption has consistently hovered between 85% and 96% of total energy use for decades. It barely budges.
And the inevitable mathematical consequence of burning that much fossil fuel is reflected in the emissions data. We see CO2 emissions, excluding land use change, growing steadily from their 1990 levels up to over 190 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent in recent years.
Now, obviously, climate change is a global crisis, and every country is under pressure to transition to green energy. So the question is, why is the energy transition so incredibly slow here? With all their scientific and human capital, why are they stuck at 90% fossil fuels?
What's fascinating here is the underlying economic causality. If we connect this environmental data to the bigger picture of macroeconomic volatility, it makes perfect, if somewhat tragic, sense. We have to think about the cost of capital.
Unpack that for me. How does the cost of capital stall a green transition?
Well, think about what it takes to build a massive solar farm or a wind turbine array, or to upgrade a national grid to handle intermittent renewable energy. These are highly capital-intensive long-term investments. You need billions of dollars up front, and you expect to slowly make that money back over 20 or 30 years.
Right.
But when a national government and its private sector are fighting constant, daily macroeconomic fires, hyperinflation, debt defaults, massive currency devaluation, what happens to the cost of borrowing money?
It goes through the roof. Nobody wants to lend you money for 30 years if they think the currency might collapse next week.
Exactly. Capital becomes incredibly expensive and extremely short-sighted. Long-term investments in green energy transition simply cannot secure stable financing in a hyper-volatile environment. Those green investments take a backseat to the immediate, desperate, existential need for reliable, cheap, existing power.
Because if the power grid fails, the whole house collapses. You have to keep the agricultural export machine running to get dollars. You have to keep the cities electrified so the digital shock absorbers keep functioning.
So the country defaults to the established, existing fossil fuel infrastructure. It is the fastest, most reliable way to fuel the stabilizers, even at the cost of rising carbon emissions. It's an environmental sacrifice made at the altar of economic survival.
It's a survival tax paid in carbon. That is a sobering way to look at it. And alongside that environmental trade-off, there is also a global trade-off. We need to look briefly at how Argentina interacts with the rest of the world economy, specifically looking at tariffs.
The WDI data tracks the applied tariff rate, which is a simple average of the taxes imposed on imported goods. In recent years, that data shows the tariff rate stabilizing between 11% and 14%.
Let's translate what that 11 to 14% band actually means in practice. If a country has zero tariffs, it's a pure free trade zone. If it has 50 or 60% tariffs, it's an autarkic, closed economy trying to isolate itself from the world. So 11 to 14% is somewhere in the middle.
It reflects a very deliberate, sometimes protective tightrope walk. The government is constantly trying to balance two opposing forces. On one hand, they have an industrialized urban workforce that is highly vulnerable to cheap foreign imports. If you drop tariffs to zero, local factories might close, causing mass unemployment in those hyper-urbanized cities, which spikes the Gini coefficient and breaks the social peace.
Right, so they use the 11 to 14% tariff to shield certain domestic industries and keep people employed.
Yes. But on the other hand, they absolutely must integrate into global value chains because they need to export their massive agricultural surplus, and they need to import the advanced technology and fertilizer to keep those yields high, so they can't close the door entirely.
It's a constant, fragile recalibration between protecting the fragile domestic economy and participating in the brutal global market.
Exactly. It's a high-wire act.
Okay, we have covered an immense amount of ground today. We've journeyed through this 15-part World Bank data stack, from demographics to digital wallets to carbon emissions. Now, we need to bring it all together for the learner. We need to synthesize this massive pile of indicators into a single, cohesive picture of national development.
I think the best way to visualize this synthesis is to imagine three overlapping circles, a classic Venn diagram mapping the competing realities of the nation.
Let's build it. I love a good mental model. Okay, circle one is human capital. Inside this circle, we place the undeniable world-class achievements we discussed. The 99.4% primary education enrollment, the drastic 90% reduction in child mortality, the repair of the wealth gap post-crisis, the 100% electrification and clean cooking fuels. This circle represents a highly developed, modern social foundation.
Right. And circle two is technological and resource resilience. This circle holds the twin shock absorbers. It contains the agricultural yields that quadrupled through advanced fertilizer and tech adoption, and it contains the digital explosion, the mobile banking revolution that bypassed broken systems and brought financial lifelines to the poorest 40% of the urban population.
And then looming over both of those is circle three, macro vulnerability. This is the historical trauma of 3,000% hyperinflation. It's the sheer violence of national income swinging up and down by 38%. It's the decade-long stagnation of the middle income trap. And it's the structural reliance on fossil fuels because capital is too expensive to fund a green transition.
The ultimate puzzle of Argentina, the diagnostic reality that baffles economists, is sitting right there in the intersection of those three circles. The data unequivocally proves that the country is not fundamentally broken in the way casual headlines assume. It's not a failed state. The human and physical infrastructure is actually ready and waiting for a high-income economy. The future of the country relies entirely on figuring out how to leverage its massive, proven strengths, its highly educated, digitally connected populace, and its ultra-productive land to finally break the exhausting cycle of monetary instability.
It's all there, waiting for the macroeconomy to catch up. Going through this data completely reframes how you look at the news. You stop seeing just the currency crisis, and you start seeing the incredibly resilient, adaptive society underneath it. Which leaves you, the learner, with a lingering, provocative question to take away today. Think about your own country, your own community, or even your own industry. We so often fall into the trap of assuming that an unstable system, like a volatile currency, a chaotic political cycle, or a struggling corporate sector, means that everything in that system is fundamentally broken. We assume the foundation is as rotten as the roof. But Argentina's data proves that you can have world-class social infrastructure, total electrification, and cutting-edge digital inclusion existing right alongside extreme textbook monetary volatility.
It demands that we challenge our basic assumptions about what structural success and failure actually look like in the real world.
Exactly. So my question to you is, what other failing systems in the world, or perhaps even in your own life or organization, might actually be hiding incredibly robust, resilient foundations just beneath the surface? Sometimes you have to look past the broken X-ray machine. You have to stop looking at the jagged lines on the monitor and realize that the patient is actually adapting, innovating, and surviving in ways the experts never expected. Thank you for taking this deep dive into the data with us. Keep questioning the narrative, keep looking for the hidden resilience, and we'll see you next time.